The letter arrived in a crisp white envelope stamped with the HOA's gaudy gold emblem. I already knew it was bad news before I even opened it. The HOA never sent anything unless it was a fine, a complaint, or some ridiculous new rule designed to make life miserable. But this was something else entirely. Effective immediately, your HOA dues will be increased by 500% to cover necessary community improvements. Failure to comply will result in penalties, liens, and possible legal action. I read it again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. 500%? That wasn't an increase, it was daylight robbery. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA board that thinks they're above the law, hit subscribe. You won't believe how this story ends. I stormed into the HOA office, a squat little building at the end of the cul-de-sac, and pushed open the door. Behind the desk sat the devil herself, Gloria Elworth, the HOA president. She was a middle-aged woman with a permanently sour expression, the kind of person who thrived on making life miserable for everyone else. She looked up from her computer and gave me a fake, tight-lipped smile. Mr. Dawson, I assume you're here about the dues? You assume, right? I said, dropping the letter onto her desk. What kind of scam is this, Gloria? Gloria folded her hands and leaned forward. It's not a scam, it's necessary. The HOA has decided to make several improvements to the neighborhood. That costs money. Improvements? Like what? New landscaping? Repainting the clubhouse? Upgrading the pool area? I cut her off. I don't use the clubhouse. I don't use the pool. And I sure as hell don't care about what flowers you plant. Why should I be forced to pay for it? Gloria's fake smile widened. Because that's how an HOA works, Mr. Dawson. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. I clenched my jaw. I had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. I wasn't going to be bullied out of my own home by some power-hungry bureaucrat. You can't just raise fees by 500% overnight, I said. That's extortion. Oh, but we can, she said sweetly. It was voted on by the board. The board, I muttered, shaking my head. The same board that was made up of Gloria and her little group of yes-men. This isn't over, I said. She chuckled. I'm sure it's not. I walked out of that office fuming, but I wasn't about to roll over and accept this. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I'd show them just how dirty I could get. But what I discovered next would change everything in our neighborhood forever. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging into the HOA's financials. I wasn't going to just sit back and accept Gloria's blatant money grab. If she thought she could drain the neighborhood dry without consequences, she was about to get a nasty surprise. I pulled up the HOA's last few years of budget reports, which I had access to as a homeowner, though they weren't exactly easy to find. After some digging, I started noticing discrepancies. The fees collected didn't match the expenses listed. There were vague charges for administrative costs that made no sense, and payments to a company called Ellsworth Property Management. That name rang a bell. It didn't take long to confirm my suspicion. The company belonged to none other than Gloria's nephew. She had been funneling HOA funds into a business run by her own family. I chuckled under my breath. That was exactly the kind of corruption I had expected. But exposing her wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel the consequences immediately, and I had just the plan. I made a few calls to some friends who worked in utilities and city planning. After some back and forth, I found exactly what I was looking for. The HOA office's power supply was separate from the rest of the neighborhood. It was on its own grid, tied to a commercial account. And that meant if someone requested a review of the account due to financial irregularities, like, say, a fraudulent transfer of funds, it could trigger an automatic suspension of service until the issue was resolved. I submitted the request that evening. The paper trail Gloria had left behind was about to lead to her downfall in ways she never imagined. If you've ever wanted to see justice served to a corrupt HOA, keep watching, because what happens next is truly satisfying. The next morning, I drove by the HOA office just in time to see Gloria and her cronies standing outside, staring at the darkened windows. The power had been cut. No lights, no air conditioning, no computer access. I parked across the street and watched as confusion turned to panic. Gloria's voice rose in frustration as she barked orders into her phone, but there was nothing she could do. The power company wasn't going to restore service until the financial discrepancies were cleared up, and that could take weeks. Residents started gathering, murmuring amongst themselves. Word spread quickly that the HOA was in trouble. A few homeowners approached me asking if I knew what was going on. I played it off at first, but when I saw the growing frustration in their faces, I knew it was time to strike. I pulled out my laptop and showed them what I had found in the HOA's financial records: the payments to Gloria's nephew, the unexplained fees, the excessive dues increases. Everything was there in black and white. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People exchanged angry looks. Gloria must have noticed the shift in the atmosphere because she stormed over, face flushed with rage. She demanded to know if I had anything to do with the power outage. I simply smiled and handed her a printed copy of my findings. She snatched the papers and scanned them quickly, her expression shifting from anger to something else: fear. She had been caught, and she knew it. The homeowners around us weren't just upset anymore, they were furious. Someone suggested calling for an emergency vote to remove Gloria and the board. Others demanded an external audit of the HOA's finances. And just like that, the power Gloria had wielded over us for years began to crumble. As more residents joined the conversation, demanding transparency and accountability, I leaned against my car and watched the chaos unfold. Satisfaction settled deep in my chest. Gloria had thought she could bleed us dry without consequences, but she had underestimated the very people she had been exploiting. And now, standing in the sweltering heat outside her powerless office, she was finally realizing that her reign was over. But Gloria wasn't going down without a fight, and what she did next would shock the entire neighborhood. The crowd outside the powerless HOA office swelled as more homeowners arrived, drawn by the growing commotion. Murmurs turned to open outrage as copies of the damning financial records passed from hand to hand. People pointed at the documents, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some glared at Gloria, their faces tight with anger, while others whispered bitterly about the years of unexplained fees and arbitrary fines. Gloria's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the papers I had handed her, her knuckles turning white. She shuffled through them, her eyes darting frantically across the numbers and signatures. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, though whether from the heat or the realization that her little empire was crumbling, I couldn't be sure. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as though flipping a switch, she straightened and attempted to regain control. Her voice rang out over the crowd, sharp and commanding, but there was an unmistakable edge of desperation beneath the surface. She insisted that the documents were being misinterpreted, that the payments to her nephew's company were legitimate, and that the increased dues were necessary for the community's upkeep. She claimed that everything had been approved through the proper channels, and if people had concerns, they should schedule an appointment to discuss them privately. That was the final straw. A middle-aged man near the front of the group, a retired contractor named Bill, stepped forward. His voice carried weight, honed by years of managing construction crews and negotiating with stubborn clients. He reminded everyone that the homeowners had a right to call for an immediate vote to remove the HOA board if there was evidence of financial mismanagement. He referenced the very bylaws Gloria had used as a weapon against us for years, citing the clause that allowed residents to demand a special election with enough signatures. Hope flickered in the eyes of those gathered, quickly replaced by determination. People nodded in agreement, and someone pulled out a clipboard and a stack of blank petition forms. Gloria's composure cracked. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her gaze flicked from one homeowner to the next, realizing that the control she had wielded for so long was slipping through her fingers like sand. If you're enjoying this story of neighborhood justice, smash that subscribe button. The best part is still coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next. A woman named Angela, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, spoke up. Her voice was steady, unwavering. She reminded everyone of the countless times the HOA had issued unfair fines, enforced rules selectively, and dismissed complaints from residents who couldn't afford to fight back. She spoke about the elderly couple who had been threatened with foreclosure over a minor landscaping violation, the single mother who had been harassed for having a child's bicycle in her driveway, the veterans who had been told they couldn't fly the American flag outside their homes. More voices joined in, each one adding to the growing list of grievances. Gloria took a step back, her carefully maintained mask of authority crumbling. She tried to argue to insist that the homeowners were being irrational, but the crowd wasn't listening. The petition filled with signatures faster than I had expected. People lined up to add their names, their faces set with determination. The momentum was unstoppable. Then a low, amused voice cut through the noise. It was a man I had never seen before, standing near the back of the group. He was tall, dressed in business casual attire, and carried a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as an attorney specializing in HOA litigation. Apparently, he had been invited by one of the homeowners who suspected trouble was brewing. He calmly explained that given the evidence of financial misconduct, the board could face legal consequences beyond just removal. If homeowners pursued a lawsuit, they could recover misused funds and possibly dissolve the HOA altogether if corruption was proven. That sent a ripple through the crowd, excitement mixed with righteous fury. Gloria's face drained of color. Her fingers clenched the stack of documents like they were the only thing keeping her upright. She stammered something about needing to consult with legal counsel, but her words barely registered. The homeowners weren't waiting for her permission anymore. A vote was scheduled for that very evening, using the emergency provisions in the bylaws. Volunteers spread the word, knocking on doors and sending messages to every resident in the community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood gathered in the park near the now darkened HOA office. A folding table was set up with ballots, and residents cast their votes one by one. Gloria and her cronies stood off to the side, watching helplessly as the tide turned against them. She had ruled through intimidation and bureaucracy for years, but none of that mattered now. When the final count was announced, the results were overwhelming. Gloria and the entire board had been voted out. A cheer erupted from the crowd. People clapped each other on the back, shaking hands and celebrating. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity among the homeowners, a shared relief that the nightmare was finally over. Gloria didn't wait for a formal dismissal. She turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched, her face blank. No one stopped her. But our victory over Gloria was only the beginning, and what we discovered next would shake our neighborhood to its core. In the following days, an audit was launched into the HOA's finances, revealing even more shady dealings. The attorney helped the homeowners file a lawsuit, and within months, the HOA was dismantled entirely. With the restrictive rules and outrageous fees gone, the neighborhood flourished. People painted their houses the colors they wanted, decorated their yards without fear of fines, and enjoyed their homes without the constant threat of HOA interference. As for me, I installed a new set of floodlights in my driveway just because I could. And every time I flipped them on, basking in the warm glow of freedom, I couldn't help but think back to the night the HOA had been plunged into darkness. Poetic justice at its finest. In the days following the vote, the neighborhood pulsed with a kind of energy I hadn't seen in years. People who had once kept to themselves were suddenly chatting with their neighbors, making plans for improvements that actually mattered to them, and exchanging ideas on how to keep the community in good shape without the iron fist of the HOA. The tension that had loomed over the streets like a storm cloud had lifted, replaced by a fresh sense of possibility. Of course, Gloria didn't just disappear overnight. She might have lost her position, but she wasn't the type to go down without trying to claw her way back up. I spotted her a few times, skulking around the neighborhood, speaking in hushed tones with the few remaining loyalists she had left. They were the same people who had benefited from her reign, those who had mysteriously avoided fines while others had been buried under them. But they were vastly outnumbered now, and they knew it. The day after the vote, a locksmith arrived to change the locks on the HOA office. The community hired an interim committee to secure records and begin the transition process. The attorney who had advised us suggested filing a formal injunction to prevent Gloria or any of her former board members from interfering with financial matters until a full audit was completed. That same afternoon, a process server showed up at Gloria's house with paperwork. She refused to take it at first, but the law didn't care about her pride. The documents were taped to her door, legally served whether she liked it or not. A few days later, I was in my garage when Bill, the retired contractor, dropped by with a grin that told me he had news. He wasted no time diving into it. The audit had uncovered even more financial misdeeds than we had initially suspected. The payments to Gloria's nephew's company were just the tip of the iceberg. There were inflated invoices for landscaping services that had never been performed, maintenance costs that didn't align with any actual work done, and even a suspicious consulting fee that had been paid out to a shell company, one that, upon closer inspection, traced back to an account in Gloria's name. She had been siphoning off money for years, and now the paper trail was undeniable. But the most shocking revelation was still to come, and it would finally bring Gloria to justice once and for all. Bill leaned against the workbench in my garage, shaking his head in disbelief. The HOA had been sitting on a reserve fund that was supposed to be used for emergencies, yet it had been nearly drained by Gloria's schemes. That 500% dues increase. It had never been about improving the community. It was a last-ditch effort to cover up the financial black hole she had created before anyone could notice. But now everyone knew. The community wasted no time filing a formal lawsuit against Gloria and the former board members who had enabled her. The attorney helped draft the case, citing fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence was airtight and the case moved forward swiftly. As the legal battle unfolded, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without the HOA breathing down our necks, people took pride in their homes again. Not out of fear of fines, but because they wanted to. Yards that had once been forced into uniform monotony blossomed with individuality. Driveways were no longer battlegrounds for nitpicking violations. That old clubhouse Gloria had insisted needed costly renovations. It turned out the structure was perfectly fine. A few volunteers patched up minor wear and tear, and suddenly it was a usable space again. One evening, as I sat on my porch enjoying the hum of a neighborhood that finally felt like home, Angela stopped by with an update. She had been tracking the court proceedings closely, and things were not looking good for Gloria. The judge wasn't buying any of her excuses. The lawsuit had unearthed even more damning details. Not only had she been misusing funds, but she had also been manipulating property values to benefit herself and her allies. Several homeowners who had mysteriously received lower than average appraisals when selling their homes, that had been orchestrated to allow Gloria's associates to buy properties at a discount. The court ordered a forensic accountant to go through every transaction. By the time they were done, the estimated damages exceeded hundreds of thousands of dollars. Gloria had no way out. A few weeks later, she was formally charged with fraud and financial misconduct. The court froze her assets, and she was forced to surrender her house to cover part of the restitution. It was poetic justice. She had spent years using the HOA to control others, and now she was being stripped of everything she had gained through corruption. The final blow came when her nephew's fraudulent property management company was exposed. He had been receiving HOA funds for non-existent services, and under legal pressure, he turned on Gloria to save himself. His testimony sealed her fate. The day Gloria officially moved out, the neighborhood gathered to watch. She loaded what little she had left into a car with a hollow expression. There were no goodbyes, no sympathetic glances, just the quiet satisfaction of a community that had reclaimed its freedom. As her car disappeared down the street, Bill let out a long whistle and turned to me. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. Neither had I. But the story of our neighborhood's rebirth was just beginning, and what happened next transformed our community in ways we never could have imagined. With Gloria gone, the lawsuit concluded, and the HOA officially dissolved, we were finally free. The neighborhood had endured years of control, but in the end, we had won. Not just by removing her, but by proving that a community could stand together and take back what was theirs. And as I looked around, seeing my neighbors laughing, talking, and enjoying their homes without fear, I knew one thing for sure. We were never going to let anyone like Gloria rule over us again. With Gloria gone and the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood felt like an entirely different place. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and for the first time in years, people had control over their own homes. Instead of worrying about arbitrary fines or ridiculous regulations, neighbors focused on improving the community in ways that actually made sense. But despite Gloria's departure, there were still loose ends to tie up. The legal battle had concluded, but the damage she had caused needed fixing. The financial mismanagement had drained resources, and while we had recovered some of the stolen funds through the lawsuit, there was still work to be done. Angela, Bill, and a handful of other homeowners took the lead in organizing a plan for moving forward. Without an HOA dictating every detail, we had to figure out a way to maintain shared spaces without falling into the same cycle of corruption. No one wanted another power-hungry group taking over. A town hall meeting was called at the park, drawing nearly every resident. People brought lawn chairs and coolers, treating it less like a formal event and more like a community gathering. The air buzzed with excitement rather than frustration, a stark contrast to the tense meetings we had suffered through under Gloria's rule. Angela stood in the center addressing the group, while Bill held a clipboard, taking notes on suggestions. People threw out ideas for keeping the neighborhood in good shape without reinstating an HOA. Some proposed a voluntary association with clear, limited responsibilities, while others suggested splitting maintenance duties among willing participants. One of the biggest concerns was the shared spaces, the clubhouse, the playground, and the small green belt that ran through part of the neighborhood. Without an HOA, there was no longer an official budget for upkeep. But rather than arguing, people began volunteering resources. A retired landscaper offered to maintain the green belt at cost. A group of parents formed a committee to handle playground repairs. Even the old clubhouse, which had once been a symbol of HOA overreach, was repurposed as a free-use space that anyone could reserve without interference. The most surprising part? Everything started running more smoothly than it ever had under Gloria. Without pointless bureaucracy and personal vendettas dictating decisions, people actually wanted to contribute. Instead of being forced to pay exorbitant fees for services they didn't need, homeowners could choose to help in ways that made sense for them. Meanwhile, I had my own project to handle. With Gloria's financial crimes exposed, there was still the matter of what would happen to her house. The court had seized it to cover part of the restitution, and it was set to go up for auction. I had no interest in buying it myself, but I knew someone who did. A few days before the auction, I met with a local nonprofit that specialized in helping veterans and low-income families secure affordable housing. After explaining the situation, they were more than eager to place a bid. The idea of turning Gloria's former home into a safe haven for someone in need was too perfect to pass up. When the auction day arrived, several of us showed up to witness it. Gloria was nowhere in sight. She had disappeared entirely after the lawsuit, likely too ashamed to show her face. Watching her house be sold off felt like the final nail in the coffin of her reign. The nonprofit won the bid, and within weeks, renovations began. The house was transformed, stripped of the gaudy, unnecessary modifications Gloria had made to distinguish herself from the rest of us. By the time the work was finished, it looked like a home again, rather than a monument to corruption. The family that moved in was a young couple with 2 kids, both parents working in public service. They had been struggling to find affordable housing, and the nonprofit's assistance gave them the opportunity they needed. Seeing them settle in, watching their kids ride bikes in the driveway without fear of some ridiculous HOA complaint, was the final victory. Gloria had spent years dictating how the neighborhood should function, convinced that her vision was the only one that mattered. But in the end, it was the people she had tried to control who proved that a community could thrive without her interference. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, I realized that the battle wasn't just about defeating an HOA. It was about proving that people could govern themselves without greed or power games ruining everything. And as far as I was concerned, we had won.